Would you believe that there is a genre out there that almost exclusively existed in the year of 1995? There isn't exactly a name for it, but it does encompass games like Gen War, Robotica, Space Griffin VF9, and of course this, Kileak. All of them are essentially corridor shooters where you play as mechs in a horror theme, and while they certainly do look like other games from other series, they all play in this certain way. Each are first person, but every single one takes place inside of a mecha of some sort. You're always disadvantaged and in a dire situation that requires you to survive under extreme circumstances. In a lot of ways, they were close to dungeon crawlers rather than actual first person shooters, but honestly, the task of describing them is extremely difficult. You'll have to actually get up and play one of these to know what I'm talking about. It's definitely very interesting to discover something like this, but it doesn't necessarily make these weird little games good. As you probably assumed, the game I'm looking at today happens to be part of this weird subgenre, but it's also just downright terrible. Beginning with the image of seminal fluid, I didn't really know what to expect here. The game begins with a lot of interesting FMVs that help explain the world a little bit, but the plot ends up being basic. You're a stranded operative trying to stop an evil scientist after it's been discovered that he is, surprise, evil, and also he has access to a ton of weird monsters. I really wish a little bit more was done with the story here because I really like the mecha design. It's got this weird cyberpunk nautical look to it that I can really get behind. Sadly, nothing else in the game is like this, including the enemies, which all look terrible. Despite the game opening up with the promise of monsters and mayhem, you pretty much get a whole lot of robots here. I'm not even sure unimaginative is the proper word here. It's more like just plain lazy. Nothing seems to be designed with the fact that it might exist in this mining/scientific area. It's all exploding geometric shapes and spinning blades and whatnot, and I just can't wrap my head around the fact that there is a killer floor in this game. I mean, where exactly did someone manufacture a killer floor, and for what reason? Seriously, why does a mining or scientific complex need a killer floor?
Repair parts secured.
Those biological enemies that appear later on are just as bad. Laughably, they include things like flying eyeballs, spiders, and smaller spiders. It feels like a 10-year-old designed every single one of these enemies, including the bosses, which are just downright pitiful. In case you want to play this, I'm not going to mention the last boss, but if you do get to it, it's extremely disappointing. I'd have to say it's one of the worst boss encounters I've ever experienced in a game thus far. The environments that you start in are not too bad. You can see beds and setups and that let you get a scope of how big your mech actually is. However, this does not keep up. Only a third of the game is actually like this. The rest is all blank, samey, textured walls that look just downright terrible. Not only is this extremely boring visually, it also makes the game hard to navigate, as every hallway can look almost exactly the same. You'll be spending the majority of your experience looking at the corner of the screen because that's where the map is, and it's the only way to know where to go.
When you want to play the hottest, fastest, most advanced fighting game ever, forget everything else and play Doom 2 on your PC.
It's surprising to think that in 1995, people were comparing Kileak to Doom, even though the two games only really share a viewpoint. I'm not 100% sure if it was Sony or Genkai saying this, maybe even both, but I find it to be somewhat of a funny statement, especially considering that Doom itself would never actually have a proper port on the PlayStation. Though looking back now, I wonder if that had more to do with the difficulty of programming for the system rather than the hardware limitations themselves, especially considering Doom can run on something like a toaster. Processing power aside, the main issue with putting a first-person shooter on PlayStation lied in the limitation of its controller. Being a flagship title for the PlayStation, there was no access to the DualShock, so joysticks were not an option. This would force developers to come up with archaic and extremely difficult control schemes to make things work, ultimately resulting in gameplay that can be both frustrating and sometimes painful. Kileak certainly suffered from this, but it's not alone. Even titles considered excellent, such as Disruptor, do have this issue. The controller is just too stiff to facilitate a full range of 3D movement. Was this entirely on the developer? No, but it does make any sort of Doom-like experience extremely difficult. But there are so many other reasons why Kileak is objectively bad. Movement might be limited, but this doesn't really help when there's no movement to be had at all. The entirety of the game takes place in tight, featureless corridors, so you're only able to inch left and right. Specifically left and right when you're faced with an enemy. This doesn't allow for a whole lot of strategy, and instead you're trying to outfire the enemy before it whittles your health down, which enemies certainly do, considering the draw distance on the PlayStation always left a whole lot to be desired. Though in Kileak's defense, you usually see an enemy before it's coming, unless it's placed at the end of a hallway. There is a proximity sensor that allows you to know when enemies are close by. However, long-range enemies exist outside of this and are therefore able to hit you without you even knowing they're there. This is a severe disadvantage. Worse yet, sometimes the only way to know they're there is when they start firing upon you. This adds an incredible amount of frustration to a game where you're already dealing with limited resources. Initially, health packs are plentiful and sometimes dropped by enemies, however they do not heal you for the amount that you would think. Sometimes you'll receive 1 or 2 hit points, sometimes you'll receive 20 or 25, the values are just all over the place. Ammunition doesn't seem to suffer this problem, but it does become so limited later on that you're often in states where you have to reload a save. I found myself deadlocked numerous times, ammo-less, and forced to use energy weapons that eat up my battery, and in this game, if you use your battery, you die. Energy in this game basically acts as a soft timer. When it runs out, you are no longer able to operate and therefore dead. There are charging stations and batteries to replenish this, however energy weapons use this as a source of ammunition. When you're forced to use a weapon that basically causes you to die as you use it, it's kind of just a cheap tactic to make the game harder and therefore last longer, which I suppose isn't surprising as this game is probably only about 3 or 4 hours long. Not exactly a detractor from the experience considering most games for PlayStation only really run this length unless they're an RPG, but it's 4 or 5 hours of downright terrible gameplay. I really wanted to like Kileak. It does occupy that weird subgenre that I'm very much interested in, and I will be exploring other games in it, but this one was just not a very good example. What is good here is front-loaded. Everything at the start of the game is excellent, and I think that was more of a way to get people to buy the new PlayStation console when it was being released. To play the first few levels, you will feel that this game isn't that bad. The environments are nice, the weapons are okay, and there is a whole lot of FMV cutscenes to get you into the action, but the cracks begin to show rather quickly, only about a quarter into the game. Even its basic story starts to fall apart as random things begin to happen without any explanation whatsoever. You do have a partner that radios you here and there, explaining what's going on and help driving the plot forward, but he disappears completely by the end of the game. And honestly, the end of this game is absolutely bonkers. There is no real way to describe it, so I'll show you a few minutes and you can check out the rest on your own. So enjoy. Well, that's Kileak, and can you believe this game actually had 2 sequels technically, the third being Brahma Force. It has no ties to the story, but the gameplay was recycled there. That and the other game Epidemic are definitely on my to-do list, but right now I'd just like to thank you for watching. Playing these games has definitely been a huge journey for me, and it's helped me mentally as well, so I thank you for supporting me just by watching. If you can leave a like and subscribe, I would appreciate it, but of course it's not mandatory. This has been Gorehound, and I'll see you on the next review.